You ever had a conversation change your life? Well, part of my life is learning that lesson the hard way. I've had so many conversations that literally I can't even imagine living without. Now, a lot of that is for a different episode, but today I want to share how a simple conversation that I didn't even start is already impacting my life. So the other day, I was coming out of the gym and I went to Quick Trip to pick up the kids' donuts for breakfast. And I was wearing my Dad's Edge shirt, which is where my story originally began, with a following of the Dad's Edge podcast. And a guy noticed it and said, "Hey, I listened to that podcast too." Now, this is the only time, pretty much in forever, that I can ever remember, someone's noticed the shirt that I was wearing and recognized where it's come. I wear the hat pretty much all the time for about the last 5 years. No one has ever said, "Hey, I know that podcast." Well, today it was that day. And this dad comes up to me and says, "Hey, I listened to that podcast too." And then I was like, "Hey, I got 2 other podcasts that I also started because of listening to the Dad's Edge." So part of what I want to share today is how this podcast really got started. And what you don't always know is when you start asking better questions, you get better answers. And when I went into fatherhood and went and surrounded myself with other dads doing things at a level that I couldn't yet comprehend, and one of those was podcasting. I had been a podcast listener probably since 2015. And part of that story was, I'm not that kind of guy that does a podcast. Now, I probably in the back of my head really wanted to do a podcast, but again, the voice inside my head, we've talked about that ego, he would always tell me, guys like you do not do podcasts. And that just kind of permeated there. And then fast forward, listening to the Dad's Edge, involved in the mastermind, the Dad's Edge Alliance, I was really getting hungry for something bigger. I was really getting hungry for building something different than what I was doing in my career. Fast forward to September of 2018, I went to a military influencer conference down in Orlando. And it's a conference for other military influencers to come together and network and essentially learn from each other. Well, one of those conversations was a military spouse who I told my story about coming home, helping other dads, trying to figure out my own life, and she started crying. And in that moment when she started crying, I was like, what just happened? And what happened was her husband came home from war, but didn't emotionally come home from war. And my story triggered a feeling in her that was pretty deep. Now, I'm not sure how often she's cried because of that feeling, but in that moment, it validated that my story helped, my story did that, and that I needed to do it more. And so it was from September of 2018, I went back on the plane ride home from Orlando back to Chicago, and I wrote out the business plan for Military Veteran Dad, my first podcast. And I did this mind map, and I essentially came up with the mission to bring every dad home. As you listen to this podcast, Business of Fatherhood, home is something that all men are looking for. And that's kind of been the big thesis that I've been looking for when I first started that Military Veteran Dad, that I didn't fully know what that word home meant. But now I fully understand that it's a feeling, not a building. Fast forward from September 2018 to January of 2019, I work on the podcast and I launch on January 1st, 2019. And the rest is in the history books. Military Veteran Dad is still a podcast out there. It is still going strong. 2.5 years later, it is still impacting dads and military dads and helping them understand a lot of the things that we go through and a lot of the things that prevent us as military dads from coming home. That podcast became the genesis for what this podcast is, the Business of Fatherhood, to help other dads understand that you maybe have been looking for this feeling of home and been told that it exists in a building and what you do and how you're defined by your career and your titles, but it's really not. Something that comes from the inside. And so the genesis of the Business of Fatherhood podcast was I realized that this mission is much wider than just military dads, and that swap out a few words, military dads and civilian dads are often having some of the same problems. And I knew that I could make a bigger impact and a deeper impact by focusing on dads that find success at work but struggle to find that balance and to get excited about coming home and pulling into their driveway of their home. And that's where this podcast, as short daily episodes, came into your life to help you get those little short bursts of inspiration and wisdom to help you go from busy dad to connected dad, and not just connected dad, but husband, human being, and feel more alive inside yourself than maybe you have your entire life. So that's a little bit about my podcast and how this got started. And I want to thank Derek Hayden for saying hello at a random Quick Trip stop here in southern Wisconsin. And I'll be back again to talk to you tomorrow.